Good morning, Suzuki Science, grade 11s. All right, so we are doing a transitional concept from evolution, which we just finished, into diversity. And so this concept, you're going to notice a lot of evolutionary talk. However, you'll notice a lot of there's new learning as well. Before I start with the new learning, however, I might have to break this video into two parts because of the time I spent with this. I do want to do a quick recap of what our previous session together looked like. So we were in an evolutionary antibiotic town hall, and in that town hall, you were debating among stakeholders who deserved to get the most money. So I still have the feedback I need to get back to, and I'm not exactly sure what format I'm going to do that in, but I have it typed up here. And there was a question asked, who won? And so I just want to, give some general, let me get rid of this thing here. I want to give some general feedback about how the session went. First of all, it went really well. I think I mentioned this in the class to the 3 different sessions that we had. I thought that this distance learning, Flipgrid, and then live meet went much better than actually we do in class. You had more time to actually think about your questions. The questions were much deeper, and it was really nice to see how hard and detailed, how hard you worked on it and how detailed your answers were and questions and answers were. So all of you were able to address the answers that were posed to you, which is somewhat unusual. All 3 groups performed quite well. I found that several of you were really on point. You were able to talk about your concept and ask really good questions and piggyback on others. Danica, I noticed that you, as you posed your question to the cattle rancher, everybody who posed a question to the cattle rancher, most of your questions were somewhat repetitive in a sense, but you always were taking a slightly different angle, and I thought that was really well done. When we do these debates, you'll find that often the ranchers, farmers, the scientists are the ones that get picked on, and that was true to form as well. In this particular one, Josiah in the second session, and Mr. Cattle Rancher in the second session, you both were asked the lion's share of the questions because everyone wants to understand why agriculture, dairy, farm, pigs, and cows should get the antibiotics when it should be used for human use. There were some flaws in the responses, but in many cases the group as a whole were not able to pick up on those flaws, which is not that atypical. Ramjot as well, you were on point. You were asking excellent questions. Japneet was excellent. You actually started off the questioning and you set a really high bar on how to ask the questions. You gave a lot of background information before you asked the question, but you were able to follow up with the answers that were given to you and carry on a back and forth dialogue, so it was really nice to see. Kriti, I also couldn't help but notice that you were asking excellent questions. Many of you asked excellent questions. I'm picking on certain names. I'm always a little hesitant to do that because you don't hear your name, then you're thinking, oh, wait a second, didn't I ask an excellent question? And really, many of you did. As I'm going through the names here, there was a couple of standouts. Ashlyn, in your role, when you were able to ask people questions about your you had a role with the government, and so people were asking you questions, and I found that you're able to respond very well, and you're quite impassioned with your responses, and they're very well done, especially for a government individual. There's something mentioned, I can't remember who said it. The FDA is the government. Someone mentioned how is the government, or asked the question, how is the government going to control the FDA? The FDA is the branch of the government that deals with drugs and food and those sorts of things. So that was kind of a flawed question, and no one really picked up on that. I will say that in this, Kajisha, you were in the hot seat a lot, and you were able to respond very well, so that was nice to see. Jasiah, you were in the hot seat all the time. I mean, every other question, sometimes 2 out of 3 questions, maybe it was 3 out of 4 questions were asked to you, and you were able to respond without sweating too much. And then Mr. Cattle Rancher, whose name I can't say because, with his accent, I wasn't sure who he was. He did an excellent job. There are flaws in his arguments, but in many cases, no one actually really went back and forth to pick the flaws out, and you did an excellent job. You're completely in character. You responded exactly the way a person in that field would respond. So I thought that was really well done. It was so well done. If you weren't able to see it, I actually recorded a little bit of Mr. Cattle Rancher so you can hear how he sounded.
biggest farm. I have less than 10,000 cattle at any given time. The cost of vaccines on average is a bit higher than antibiotics. The cost of reinstating all the medical professionals I'd need to actually give my cattle the vaccines, it would be too much for me to take on. If I was a large farm, a mega farm with 50,000 cattle, sure, I'd be very willing to do that, but it's not something feasible for me at the moment. Who was that kid? See, I'm actually a veteran of 55 years in the industry, and I want to know something from Tanika. This person represents the APUA, and they stand for limiting the use of antibiotics in general. And with that, I want to know some alternatives you have to antibiotics that we could use instead. Because at the moment, I'm hearing a lot of talk about doing this research on these things, but I don't know what these things are. Now, going on that, you scientists are always arguing about how we should cut funding for antibiotics and focus on research. But if this is already being developed, I don't see why we can keep using antibiotics and then continue research in the background. You guys talked about saving lives in the short run and also saving lives in the long run. I don't see why you can't do both. So why do we need to cut funding for antibiotics if we have this thing that's already being developed?
So the concept is phylogeny. We are now coming back to the very first days of this course. The very first days of this course, the first week, we talked about diversity. So now we're back in the diversity unit and we're going to finish it off. As I mentioned before, this concept ties or bridges the evolution and diversity together, but really this is a diversity concept. So we're going to ask you to bring your brains all the way back to day 1, February, whatever, 2nd or 3rd or something like that, and pull up some of that knowledge, because that knowledge and that learning is all a part of this. The question is, how do we classify? So we've answered this question already. We've answered this question using a concept known as taxonomy. And taxonomy is a method of classification. In addition to taxonomy, there are other ways to classify as well. Like the previous weeks, you are going to have a Google Doc that you're going to complete. This Google Doc is really your homework. It's kind of your attendance check. It's everything rolled into one. And so if I were to pull over this Google Doc so you can see what it is that I've asked you to do this time around, you'll notice it's divided into 3 colors, with the green being the minimum. It's incomplete, just don't do anything. There's green, which is the minimum. The minimum means you'll have gaps when you get into grade 12 and beyond. Yellow is complete, so that means you're completing all the knowledge that will set you okay. It's still gonna be gaps, because I mean it's distance learning. We're taking all the learning and reducing it by at least half, if not more, but it's good. And the purple is the exemplary. It's the part where you have eaten your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 6 meals a day. You've played with your little brother and sister. You've done all the chores. You've watched your 14 Netflix shows or Disney or Amazon Prime or whatever. And now what do? You do biology, I guess. And so that's where the purple comes in. Purple's a nice exemplary elaboration and detail that will give you a thorough understanding of a thorough experience. It's still not going to be the complete lesson because we've chosen not to put some content in so that we can deliver this in 3, 4, 5 hours, depending on what level, minimum to exemplary. So as you go through this, you'll notice the very first things here are the links. So I give you the resources that you're going to need to have in order to do this lesson. You'll have the green, right? The greens are the minimum, and some of you have been doing that, which is fine. In this case, you're going to get the mark that you have anyway. And as I get to certain parts of the activity, I will explain to you how to complete them. All right? As I go through this, you're going to see a link to an interactive textbook. That's the CK12. You're going to see a link to Learn 360, which we've used before. So with the Learn 360, you're supposed to work your way through it if you do it, because it's yellow. And then when you get to the end, this page here, page 9, I believe it is, you will get a mark based on how well you answer questions. You take a screenshot of that, and then you embed it into this Google Doc. That's the format. There's a Khan Academy. I think it's already been shared with you. I'm not exactly sure how to get it into the Google Classroom, so it's not shared with you automatically, but you should see it somewhere. And then there's the end of the week activity. So the end of the week activity is this Google Doc that you're going to submit, whatever level that you get done. And then this end of the week activity is the phylogeny activity. And so you'll notice that it is in yellow because if you decide that you want to do the minimum, you'll just do the cookies. If you decide you want to have a complete, you'll do the phylogeny activity. Within this phylogeny activity, I'm actually going to give you a second, later this week, video lesson on how to do the activity, how to manipulate the technology and move things around. So I'm going to be very superficial today, but later on in the week, I will give you more detail on how to do this. But you'll notice that two parts, part 1 and part 2, oddly enough, are in purple. So even when we do this in class, I only give that part to the students who completely understand the concept and who want to spend the time. You can do the activity well without doing part 1 and part 2, where you're actually just making I said actually, 3 times now? Where you're just making the phylogenetic tree, which is the lesson. The lesson is on phylogenetic trees, phylogenetic classification. All right? And then at the very end, it tells you what to submit. These are the pictures that are associated with that activity, and that's the Google Doc that you'll have. All right? So, you understand taxonomy. Many of you have forgotten though, because we did it in the first week, and so that was February 4th-ish. It's now May the 4th to be with you. And it's 3-4 months since we've done that. So you should review taxonomy. And if you go to that Learn 360 resource I have on there, it actually starts with taxonomy and then it goes into what I'm talking about now. Taxonomy relies on structural similarities and morphological shapes that look similar from one animal or one plant or one fungus to the next. It is not the only way to classify though. If you took Thor and he said, he's a snake, that would be incorrect. But based on the morphology, based on the taxonomy, you might say, oh, okay, well, he looks a lot like a snake. He doesn't appear to have legs. He does. He has vestigial legs. But if you look at a koala bear and you compare that to a panda bear and you compare that to a polar bear and a brown bear and a black bear, they all have a bear-like shape, but they're not actually all very closely related. The koala bear is a marsupial, very distantly related. The panda bear is, a bamboo eater with an opposable thumb. That's very distantly related. The brown bear, the black bear, and the polar bear, they're very closely related to each other. So we need some other way to classify these organisms. Okay? So by the end of this, you should know how to classify based on evolutionary relationships. So there's your connection between diversity and evolution. You should understand the difference between taxonomy and phylogeny, and you should be able to create a phylogenetic tree. That's the goals of this particular week. Okay? So to engage. Here, I can't really see the screen, so hopefully you can see these. I have several different organisms. So ideally I'd bring them to class, you'd handle them. Do you know what this is? Or this? Or this? I'm not even sure how well they're coming up. The light might be reflecting off a bit too much, I'm not sure. Do you know what this is? Or what this is? Right? So these are all insects. They all belong to the arthropod phyla. They all belong to the animal kingdom. So they all have some relatedness, but they're all very distinct. These are very distinct animals. They're not to be confused. So we need some method of classification. Taxonomy can work, but we're also going to use something else. So in this engage activity, this is completely optional. So if you have the time, I think I put this one in purple. I did. You're going to go back to that original mind map that we had. So in the original mind map, we did it on day 2 or day 3. You had to do a reading, and that reading, I asked you to take a whole bunch of these terms that were in the reading. So I'm going to go to it now. So here's the map. So it's still assigned to you. You still have access to it. You go into Mindomo through BYOD. You go into your map because I've shared it with the entire class. And if you need me to reshare it, just ask me and I can do that. And on here, there's all these terms from the reading. And you're supposed to make a map of those terms and how they're related to each other. And that was your concept of biodiversity around classification. Then once you've done that, then you're now going to use these words classification, taxonomy, dichotomous keys, and evolution. And you can include those 4 in the maps and make some kind of relationship. Okay? You can work on this by yourself, with a partner. Anything we do in this class from now on, I don't care how you work. If we work by yourself, with a partner, or even larger, for the most part. So that's the initial activity. So go ahead and spend, a couple minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes on that. If it's going to take you 10 minutes just to find the link, you might want to skip it and just keep on moving through the lesson. Maybe come back to this later. But this is meant to get you thinking about classification and how to pull things together. All right. Another activity that I want you to do as part of our Engage to get you, ready to go and making sure that you understood where we came from, evolution. So this is the Mentimeter. And in the Mentimeter, it's the same thing that you guys, decided which of the animals was going to be the star of Wild Wednesdays. And it turns out, well, I should show you the results. I haven't showed the class the results of this yet. But on the Mentimeter, let's see if I have it open. The winner of our streaming Wild Wednesday is none other than Whiplash. 41 people responded. Whiplash was just eked out by the tail, and then Milkshake was 10 and Pebbles was 9. Surprisingly, Thor was not last. I was glad to see that. So you're going to go to menti.com, enter that code, and you're going to tell us one word that you associate with evolution. It's going to give us this big giant word cloud, and you have to spell the word correctly, otherwise it won't work. So if you're not sure to spell the word, look it up. Choose the Canadian spelling if you have a choice. Okay. Next, we're going to open up Nearpod. So Nearpod is going to give you this video lesson is based on my PowerPoint. So you can open up the PowerPoint, and the links are all active in the PowerPoint. You probably want to have it open as we're doing this. But as I'm teaching this, I like it to have the Nearpod open. So the Nearpod is going to be shared in the Google Classroom. So you can click on the link and open it up. And then the Nearpod and this video lesson will be synchronized. I mean, as I go from one slide to the next, Nearpod slides will match it. It's not that when I click on this, it's going to move the Nearpod. You have to move it yourself. Okay? So, many of these slides here, I'm just going to gloss over because they're not that important for me to tell you. You can read them and then make notes about it. And in your interactive document, anything that I deemed especially important, you'll see a reference to it on the Google Doc. Okay, so double check to make sure what I think is important. Change. So we defined evolution already. We know that it is change. Change over a certain period of time, right? And we differentiate evolutionary change from physical change and geographical change and whatnot. And you might remember Dr. Kenneth Miller, the textbook author and professor, when I showed you that video in class, he made this statement how in light of evolution, the rest of biology makes sense. So as we talk about biological concepts, having the understanding of evolution is very important. Okay? So in this next little piece here, I'm going to ask you to explore this video. So you're going to click on this video. The link for it will be active in the Google Doc, and the link is available in the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, the way the Nearpod works, the links aren't active inside the Nearpod itself. And so in this video, you're going to see something around fashion, and they're going to talk about how it's a weird combination, right? Evolution and fashion design. How do those go together? So watch the video, take a couple minutes, and then go to your Google Doc for those of you looking at the exemplary and give us some reflection on the connection between evolution and fashion. Okay? So this lesson is focused on phylogenetic trees, on making diagrams that show the relatedness of organisms to each other. You've actually seen this before in the evidence for evolution activity. For those of you who chose to do the microbiology section, there was a cladogram, this kind of ladder. That's what we're going to start building in this lesson. Okay? So evolutionary trees, by definition, you can see here on the screen. And one of the first people, as you can imagine, if you had to guess, one of the first, and it's someone you know, that's why I said you could guess. One of the first people that created this phylogenetic tree was Charles Darwin. And his tree is indecipherable. If we look at that, it's like, what is going on, right? But you can see the basics of a tree here. You can see there's branches happening, and certain branches are really small, and some are bigger, and anything over in B is going to be related to each other, and everything over here in C is going to be related. And what he proposed, this is what he wrote in 1857 to a friend of his, Thomas Huxley. And he said, "The time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it," he did not, "when we shall have finally a fairly true genealogical tree of each great kingdom of nature." Right? And he then coined this book, The Origin of a Species. And at this point, I'd hand out The Origin of Species. You guys would look around. If you guys do anything to do with evolution and diversity, this is a book. Charles Darwin was an amazing observationist. He was able to observe the world and see things that other people could not. So on the Google Doc, you can see reference to The Origin of a Species. So I've given you a link to the Gutenberg library. And on here, they have a preprint of The Origin of a Species. So I'm asking you just to skim through here and find one passage, right? It could be a sentence, it could be a paragraph. Paragraph's kind of big. Find a passage, just skim through, look for a keyword. Your eyes, when I say skim, you kind of just scrolling down until your eyes find something that's like a keyword. And then take that, you put in the Google Doc and say, how does that passage or statement relate to evolution, and how does it relate to biodiversity? Okay. So before I move on, there are some concepts in taxonomy and classification that we talked about in the first week that you have to know. These have to be in your head as I'm moving forward. And one of them is the definition of a species. The truth is, when we identify and define words in science, we would hope that there is a very explicit definition. But species is a really odd term, in the sense that we have a lot of gray. We have a definition called the biological species definition, which we looked at in the first week of this course, that organisms are considered the same species if they can interbreed under natural conditions, producing viable offspring. So that's in the first week, you have that written down. Linnaeus, he used the fact that the organisms looked alike. If they looked alike, then they were probably the same species. And in many cases, that's true. But we also know about this thing called convergent evolution. So a lot of animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, a lot of organisms based on the environment will have very similar structures. And so that's not necessarily true. Darwin said species change. So it was hard to define a species. Ernst Mayr is the person that we're using as definition. But we know that if you don't reproduce sexually, then you can't use this definition. If you've never seen them reproduce, we can't use this definition. We know that some organisms, like bacteria, are able to reproduce by just exchanging their DNA horizontally with a neighbor. Even some plants could do that. It's called horizontal gene transfer, and we talked about that a couple weeks ago. So this species definition is very problematic. We even have some close species that are clearly different species, and they can interbreed and produce viable offspring that can go on and produce viable offspring forever. So species is a difficult term for us to really pinpoint, but you do have a general definition. One of the books that I would encourage you, for those of you interested in this topic, to read is this book. It was written last year in 2019. It was called The Tangled Tree. And this book is very well done. It talks about let me pull this up here. It talks about the early pioneers who coined the terms that we use in evolution today. And some of these names you'll recognize from when we were studying evolution. One of the terms I asked you to explore in the evidence for evolution was this ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and I mentioned that it's not true. However, this scientist who made these amazing trees, here's his name, Ernst Haeckel. Right there. He made these amazing graphical diagrams that actually looked like a tree and showed how the various divisions of life were connected. And so one of the things that he proposed was that based on the embryology, based on the development of the embryo, you could see the history of an organism played out. And what he ended up doing is he ended up doctoring his work so that his work would prove this fact. A lot of the scientists saw this and like, and you did an activity, and it looks like when you look at a pig and you compare that to a chicken and you compare that to a fish, you'll see that the mammals, their embryos look more similar for longer. But he said that the embryos represent the history, and the way he tried to classify the language was incorrect. It's a fallacy. It's not true. He fudged his data to show that it was true. And this biogenetic law that he came up with, it took a while to be broken before scientists finally enough evidence came up to show that this wasn't true. But despite this, Ernst Haeckel did provide us with a lot of really good science that we still use today. Okay? But that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, it's not true. Development does not show evolutionary history. This is the tree that Darwin was talking about. He said he hoped one day there would be a tree that shows how the kingdoms of lives were all connected. And it's incredibly complex. You can barely see this tree. This tree was created in 2008 and it's changed. It changes every year because the evolutionary tree that we use is a hypothesis. So take a look at these organisms here. We got the European wildcat, we got domestic cat, and we got the South China tiger. So my question to you, which of these two are most closely related? If you go into Nearpod and you click on the next slide, you'll see that question. You can answer it. Now, just by looking at them, you can tell that the domestic cat and the European wildcat are more closely related. I mean, just by looking at their morphology. And so the proposal or hypothesis then is that the domestic cat and the European wildcat have a recent ancestor. More recent than the tiger. The tiger is a cat as well, but its ancestor with the domesticated cat, the European wildcat, is further away. Right? And so there should be an ancestor for all cats somewhere further down in the ancestral lineage. Okay? Now we could take and use this for anything, any organism. So one of the problems with evolution, why a lot of people don't subscribe to it and they go back to their religious standpoint and their faith, is that a lot of people believe that the evolution theories state that humans came from monkeys, and that's not true. What the evolutionary theories state is that we have a common ancestor, that all life on the planet has a common ancestor. So my question for you now, and you can take a moment, is you can now go on the Google Jamboard. So the Google Jamboard is a resource. And this interactive board will allow you to draw things on it. So I'd like to see, and I'll show you what it looks like. Right, so you can take a moment. If you're going to do this though, you have to do it before you go on to the next slide, because the next slides have the answers, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to put a human, a chimp, and a gorilla. And you're going to show me, similar to those cats, which two you think are more closely related and which one is less closely related, and create kind of a tree diagram, okay? And then once you've done that, I'd like you to do some research. I would like you to look up a bonobo. What is a bonobo? So look it up. Google it. Take a look. So you might have to pause the video because I'm going to go over what the answers are. And I'm actually not going to say what a bonobo is in this because you'll look it up. And then you're going to go back to this Google Jamboard or whatever you want. Get you on a piece of paper if you'd like. And you're going to probably have to redraw this, right? So that it makes sense. So I'm just putting bonobo over here because I have room on the right hand side. But you might put it somewhere else because it might be very similar to one of these other animals. So I would like you to revise your tree so that it includes the bonobo. And this is what we're doing all the time. Scientists are constantly getting new information and have to constantly revise the tree. So hopefully your tree looks something like this. Initially you had a human and a chimpanzee. They share more in common. When you look at the DNA, when you look at the morphology and everything else, they have a more common recent ancestor. The gorilla and the human and chimpanzee have a more distant ancestor. Human, chimpanzee, and gorilla are all extant. So what do you think extant means? This ancestral species here, we don't see them anymore. So they're extinct. So you got extinct and you got extant. So can you define that? You'll see that on the Google Doc that I've asked you to define that. Okay. Now, labeling all these, a branch, like the branch of a tree, the root of the tree, the common ancestor, and anything that currently exists is extant. So for those of you said extant is a currently existing organism, you are correct. Extinct is not. Right? So the gorilla, because of where it's located, is known as an outgroup. It is not a part of the in-group of the human and the chimpanzee. It's still a part of the clade, which will be a word that you'll be looking at momentarily. So hopefully you've been able to define extant. You'll see it on the the Google Doc to define, as well as on the Nearpod. Okay. Now, when we start looking at trees, there are several different ways to describe our tree here. Our tree can be described like this. In this tree, there is no root. So we're just showing the relationship between all the organisms. In this tree, there is a root. So we have the ancestor, and then the ancestor has some kind of organism that went under speciation, and then we got the E, and then this ancestor went over here, and then another speciation event happened, and you have the A and B and the C and D. The A and B are closely related, the C and D are closely related, the E is not related to anybody until further back. Okay, so we have two different trees here, one that shows relationships and the other one shows the order that relationships occurred. Now, in terms of the phylogenetic tree that's rooted, there are several different types. A cladogram and a phylogram. Can you see the difference between the two of them? Look very carefully. You'll notice that the cladogram, all the lines here are equal, whereas in the phylogram, the lines are different. We are going to be focusing on using a cladogram because a phylogram is more complicated. Phylogram tells you how long that organism has been around, and it tells you something about the evolutionary change. The cladogram is more about relationships, and that's already complicated enough for us. So that's what we're going to stick with. In terms of our rooted tree, we can root it in a circle, we can root it in the one I just showed you, or we could do this unrooted tree. All these have their time and place. So this video is at 25 minutes. I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'll probably put the second part of this in a second video.